Today I'm going to be talking to you guys about the ladder of improvement. Essentially, how you improve at games. Specifically, in this case, I'm going to talk about Hearthstone. I'm going to go through each of these 4 steps on the ladder and understand how it applies to your game in Hearthstone and at what point you might be at and how you can get out of each of these steps. So the first one is Uncouncious Incompetence. Now, what does this mean? Uncouncious incompetence means that you are unaware of the poor decisions that you are making game by game. This is often the worst and hardest spot to get out of. If we think about a simple example where most people are probably out of, let's say your opponent played a Doomsayer on board and you don't have enough damage to answer the Doomsayer. Someone who is unconsciously incompetent will play out minions into the Doomsayer, hit end of turn, the Doomsayer will trigger and all of the minions will be destroyed, and they won't think anything about it. At the end of the game, they will think that it was either a lucky draw or their opponent has a better deck than them, and that's the reason that they lost. When in reality, they probably could have won the game if they had just played better. That's why unconscious incompetence is the most dangerous spot to be in. You don't realize how bad you are. And in fact, you probably think that you're a lot better than you actually are. It's very dangerous, so it's important that whenever you start losing a bunch of games, especially if you have a very poor win rate, to kind of sit down and analyze. Maybe you're doing something wrong, and it's not just variance. The only way to get out of this step is to recognize that you are making mistakes and then start recognizing what those mistakes are. A lot of times it's good to have a second pair of eyes, whether you have somebody watch your games and kind of commentate and tell you what they might have done, or if you just watch your own games from maybe an outside perspective. A good trick for this is I will watch my games a few days after I have played, and then just ask yourself, why didn't you play something else? And see if maybe what you played was a mistake. In fact, almost every pro player, when somebody asks them how to get better at the game, will tell them to watch your own games and then also play a lot of Hearthstone. Once you finally recognize that you're making mistakes, you'll usually move up into Councious Incompetence. Councious Incompetence is probably the shortest step that you'll be in. This is where you will recognize that you are making mistakes, usually right after you make them. In the earlier Doomsayer example, that would be playing out minions into the Doomsayer and then hitting end of turn, and then your minions get destroyed, and recognizing that you made the mistake to let your minions get destroyed by Doomsayer. Usually, players only make that kind of mistake once. They recognize that they made a mistake, and they will never make it again. In fact, when I make a Councious Incompetence error, I usually concede the game out of shame. This is the phase where I think the most learning happens. That's why it's so good to play so much Hearthstone to get better at it. Because when you play a lot of games, you have more opportunities to recognize your own mistakes and therefore improve off of the mistakes that you're making. This is also why it's good to talk out or analyze your play as you're playing and understand why you're making the plays that you are, and then understanding afterwards, if it does or doesn't work, why that play was correct or why it was wrong. Again, looking over at your own games can help you recognize your mistakes and move, of course, from unconscious to Councious Incompetence. Now, the next step is pretty straightforward, moving from Councious Incompetence to Councious Competence. This is where you don't make that mistake because you've recognized that you've made this mistake before. In our earlier Doomsayer example, let's say you recognize that if you play minions out into the Doomsayer will destroy those minions, and therefore you decide not to play out minions. You're still actively making a decision here. This is why it's called a Councious Competence thing, because you're still taking time and brain power to make this decision, and then you realize that you made the correct decision. Again, this is probably one of the easiest steps to get to, but maybe not the easiest steps to get out of. There's a lot of false positives that technically are unconscious incompetence that gets mistaken for conscious competence. It's very difficult, and not a lot of your decisions that you make will end up ever moving out of the conscious competence stage. A lot of times you need to keep regularly making those decisions to understand why you're doing it and to keep playing correctly. There are some things, though, that always move up into unconscious competence. Unconscious competence is when you don't even have to think about a decision and you just make the decision. In our Doomsayer example, let's say you've played enough games that you understand if there's a Doomsayer on the board and you can't kill it, you're not going to play minions out into it. That's a decision that almost every Hearthstone player will make without thinking about it. Almost everyone's moved into the unconscious competence stage out of this. The real issue is when we make mistakes that move into the unconscious competence. This is when we have to unlearn the things that we have already learned. Let's just make a strange example. Since I've been using Doomsayer, Let's say you think that it's correct to go ahead and play all of your minions out into a Doomsayer and let it get destroyed. You feel like you've moved from unconscious incompetence to conscious incompetence to conscious competence, and you keep making that mistake, but you think it's correct, right? You're fooling yourself into thinking it's competence, and then it moves into unconscious competence. You think that you're making the correct play over and over and over again, so much so that it becomes ingrained in the way that you play as a Hearthstone player. This is the real issue, because instead of being at unconscious competence, you're still down here at unconscious incompetence. You think that what you're playing is correct, but it's actually completely wrong. Now, that was a blatant example with the Doomsayer, but there's a lot of smaller things that this applies to. Often when you take into consideration mulligans, maybe trading in the early game, anything decision that can affect a game can have this cycle happen to it. And this is really problematic when you're learning, and this is why it's important to understand how your mind works and how your mind learns new skills. If you can recognize that you might have internalized some mistakes that you make on a regular basis, you can catch those mistakes by either watching your games or having someone else watch your games, and then realize that the way that you're playing is completely wrong. The two phases of being an unconscious are both very dangerous places to be in, and I think it's almost better to consciously make every decision while you're playing a game of Hearthstone, even the simplest decisions. You know, the difference between playing two different 2-drops. Consciously make that decision. Understand why you would rather do one versus doing the other one, and often it's matchup dependent. This way you can avoid ever being in either one of these places, because we know that both of these places are often the same thing, because we can't play Hearthstone perfectly. Consciously forming a decision and understanding why you make a play will improve your win rate astronomically. I can almost guarantee it. Ask yourself, before you ever play a card, why should you do it? Often we get this feeling that this card is the best to play here, whether that's from experience or just because we naturally want to play a specific way, whether that be more aggressive, more controlling, or whatever playstyle that we have. Consciously make that decision. Ask yourself, is this the best play for the exact moment that we're playing? Is this the best play for the exact matchup that I have? The main question that I like to ask myself is, what could possibly go wrong? Oftentimes, you recognize that there's certain cards and certain matchups that your opponent's going to have that will ruin your game plan. Knowing that your opponent does have that, or knowing that your opponent has to have it to win a certain situation, make sure you make that decision consciously. And oftentimes, this allows you to be somewhere in between these, right? Because we never play a perfect game of Hearthstone. So recognizing that we never play a perfect game, being in here is better than being stuck here at the bottom. For example, if you play a bunch of minions out into one of Priest's board wipes, you'll recognize that if you consciously thought about playing each of those minions onto the board, and you asked yourself what could go wrong, and you came up with a blank, and you said, well, nothing could possibly go wrong, and then your opponent shows you a Holy Nova that wipes your board, now you know the next time that something could go wrong. Your opponent could have a Holy Nova. Even if you didn't remember that beforehand, or you didn't even know that Holy Nova existed, you can increase your learning speed. In fact, if a new player came in with this mindset of understanding that they have to think about every decision that they make, a new player could catch up or surpass to a player who's already played this game previously by simply understanding how their brain works. And understanding this can apply to any other game that you play or any skill that you end up learning. Consciously making decisions, no matter what the application is, will help you to improve immensely. I hope that this talk was able to provide a little bit of value to you. If you thought it did, be sure to like and subscribe. If you have any questions or you think that I'm completely wrong or messed up, feel free to let me know in the comments. I'll try to get back with you as soon as I can. But otherwise, I think that's it for me.